We should
Hold
be
on,
live
let
and
me approve this here. Got it. All
yeah,
right.
we should be live and direct right now. I'm just going to, my screen is probably going to pop up and I'm going to X out of it so it won't echo.
Okay.
And okay. There we go. So we are live and direct on the Real Nordic Black YouTube channel. Uh, we have Rebecca Futo Kennedy, associate professor at Denison University. Still, is that current
Yeah, I'm still there. Yeah.
information? Yeah. Uh, professor of classical environmental women and gender studies. She is now in Greece, ancient Greece,
Oh, I'm in
Athens.
Athens right
Yeah,
now.
right, right. She's in Athens, Greece now, as we speak. She's an American professor. Denison's in Ohio, is
In
it?
Ohio. Yeah.
Is it what area of Ohio is it?
Right outside of Columbus.
Okay,
So
okay.
it's in the middle. So,
Right, right. And isn't Ohio where I've seen you said you went to school, Ohio
I went to
State.
graduate school at Ohio State University.
Okay, Buckeyes. Got you.
Yeah. I should say this correctly. The Ohio State
Right,
University.
right.
They get really upset if you don't use the "the" in front of it.
Right, right.
Um,
Um,
but I'm actually
so
from California originally, so
yeah, I've heard. I was gonna actually see if you can tell us a little bit about yourself because I've heard you. There's some similarities that me and you kind of share in some ways. But I'll let you tell it, and then I can tell you.
yeah. So I lived in San Diego most of my life, and I went to college at University of California, San Diego,
There's
and
definitely
then
a connection.
I graduated early because we were on a quarter system. So I graduated in March, and then I spent 6 months working in medical publishing before
Hmm.
I started graduate school at Ohio State. And
Yeah.
then I worked at Howard University for 2 years
Oh, I
in
didn't know
DC.
that.
Yeah. And then I worked at George Washington University for 3 years.
Okay, you're talking about the
And
HBCU,
yeah, the
Howard
HBCU
University.
at
Okay.
Howard. Yep. Yeah, I spent 2 years there. And
Right.
then
Wow.
I moved to upstate New York for a year to teach at a small college there, and then got my job at
Wow.
Denison. And I've been there now since 2009. So
Okay. No, because I didn't know that. I
yeah,
knew that Dr. Karakuni was at Howard University as well.
yeah, we did not overlap.
Wow, wow. And because
Yeah,
I
they used
had
to have an Egyptology line that
right.
actually I worked with the person I think before her.
Okay, okay.
So
Because she had maybe I can ask you this question. Have you ran into because when she was there, I had interviewed her and she ran into Chadwick Boseman.
I did not know he was also after my time. So
Okay.
yeah,
Wow. Yeah, because he had created
I know I
a
don't look it, but I'm actually older than all those people.
seriously, yeah,
I'm like
that's what I'm
almost
saying. I'm
50.
like, yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I got my
correct.
PhD in 2003.
Wow. Yeah,
So
you do look young.
yeah,
That's great.
that's
Um,
because my gray hair is all down here and you can't
I,
see it.
I no, I've definitely ran across a lot of your videos on the YouTube channel Study of Antiquity
Yeah, yeah. Nick and I have
and
done
the
quite a
Middle
few.
Ages. Right. I
Yeah.
almost thought it was your YouTube channel at first
No, it's Nick's.
because
It's Nick's YouTube channel.
right,
He
because
just did
you
a
are
series. He wanted to do a series with me, so we sort of did a
right.
series of interviews, and then he cut them up into smaller bits.
Right.
Um,
And from some of those or where a lot of my questions are going to be coming from because I get into the race and ethnicity too, and I kind of wanted to get into that.
yeah, yeah,
Um, well, one on your background, one that we have in common is the military family background.
yeah. My Marine Corps family.
Right. And
So
that pretty much kind of shaped my life and things like that. I'm living in Oslo, Norway,
yeah, yeah.
right now, right? And
That's why we're close in time zone for the
right,
only time
right,
ever.
right,
Right.
right. Well, can you tell me like what got you into the classical studies, or can you explain a little bit of the classical studies when they talk about classical studies
Yeah. So the
in
term
your
classics or classical studies, which is not a term I prefer or tend to use.
right,
I prefer to what I do is ancient Mediterranean studies. So,
right, right.
but it's the term traditionally used since the 18th or 19th century for the
Uh-huh.
study of ancient Greece and Rome. But in some cases, people use it to refer primarily to language and literature of ancient Greece and Rome. What many of us work across the spectrum. I also work a lot with grave monuments and architecture, and I work with colleagues here in Athens. I'm staying at the American School for Classical Studies.
And you go frequently back and forth
Yeah, I
to
haven't been
this.
because of COVID for a couple of years, but so this
Obviously,
has been my
yeah.
first trip back, but I'll be back in the summer as
Okay.
well. I usually come in the summers.
Mm,
But most of the people here are archaeologists, and this is the school that actually they run 2 digs in Greece, and then they also help sponsor archaeologists working throughout the Greek world.
mm.
And then they also bring students over, graduate students, primarily during the academic year, and then any students, anybody actually, undergraduate students, graduate students, high school teachers, or early career faculty come in the summers, and they travel all around Greece and take them to archaeological sites and to the museums. I think we visited like 80 museums in 6
Okay.
weeks one summer, and
Right.
archaeological sites. It's sort of
Right.
super intense.
Right.
So basically, my work centers around the study of ancient Greece and Rome. I
Right.
teach in both Italy and in Greece with my undergraduate students, and my focus is a historian more than anything else, but I'm trained in the languages, Greek and ancient Greek and Latin, and literature, and I've also worked in what's called epigraphy, which is the study of inscriptions.
Okay. Okay.
So
And
they like to carve lots of things on stone, especially the Athenians, all their laws, things like
right.
that.
Right.
But I
Right.
work mostly on grave monuments, and I try to use grave monuments to understand immigration and migration in the world.
Sounds
So,
good. And where I first heard of you wasn't actually on the internet. It was on the well, I've seen a lot of your videos on the internet, but I first heard about you through this book right here.
yep, that's source book. Yeah.
Right. And yeah, and also I end up checking some of the sources references, and I noticed that there was a lot of you guys
Yeah,
sourced
and
this.
I actually watched your. I used to use that book to teach with.
You watched my video.
I did. I watched it.
Oh man.
Yeah, I was like, but she had Ben Isaac on. I have to watch this because I
Sure.
have disagreements with Ben Isaac. So
Right, right. And as you know, there was no other African American that interviewed him. I was the first. He said in that video. So yeah. But you okay, you got okay. Could you talk about some of the differences or
yeah. So
whatever? I'm
about
sure you guys would have some differences. I mean, you have more
yeah. I mean,
modern.
well, part of the
Yours was
fundamental
published
difference.
way later than his. So
Well, my book is actually not intended to be an argument or a narrative like that. I came up with the idea for that book, which my colleague Sidner, Roy, and then Max Goldman joined us a little bit later.
okay.
The idea behind that book was actually to make the ancient sources accessible
Right.
to students and to people outside of the discipline who can't
Right.
read ancient Greek and Latin.
Right. Right.
And so because I was teaching a course, I started teaching a course in 2008, and it's impossible to get an undergraduate curriculum together without having to buy 20 books or having to like get these old translations from the 19th century that were filled with racist language and just not very good. And I had read Isaac's book when it came out, and in terms of the sourcing and in terms of the sort of depth of the what he does, I found it a really great read. But over the past 15 years, and also before that, my background, so I went to, at UCSD, I went to, it's on the college system, and I went to what was Thurgood College when I started, but it became Thurgood Marshall College. And its core curriculum is critical race theory and the understanding of, so we read, major Supreme Court landmark cases. All freshmen were required to read this. All freshmen were required to read Toni Morrison and Zora Neale Hurston and Derek Bell, all this stuff. And so that my background is actually quite different from his in the sense that my training is in critical race theory and anthropological theory. And so I have a minor in sociology from undergraduate. So when I come at an understanding of race, then my understanding
I'm glad you brought up CRT because we can go into a little bit about that later. Because when people first hear that, especially because I have a big group of not just Americans but Norwegians also
and so they're
listening.
seeing this like insanely stupid discourse happening in the U.S. right now.
Right, and they're like, but you know, sometimes that can, you know, if they seeing white folk over there being scared of and they're banning books, and what is this thing that they're talking about? But
Yeah.
anyhow,
But so my work is actually, I look at race much more from a structural and institutional perspective
right,
and a legal perspective. So because a
right.
lot of what I do is actually about understanding how immigration laws are enacted and policies are crafted, and then how that's reflected in and reflective of popular movements and popular imagination, fears of foreignness and
Right, right.
integration and inclusiveness. And so how is that how does the legal landscape of the city work? So I wrote a book in Athens called Immigrant Women in Athens. It actually looks at the legal landscape of the city and how foreign women were particularly targeted in the laws.
And I couldn't go through the long list of recent publications because
I've published a bit.
you do have a bunch of publications that
Yeah.
I didn't announce, and I'm sorry about that, but I didn't have
Yeah,
you
no,
have a
it's fine.
long list of book chapter
Yeah.
contributions and
Yeah.
stuff.
And then
Yeah.
I edited a volume with my colleague Molly Jones Lewis, who is
Right.
a Roman historian, and she does the history of medicine and law, and on identity and the environment. And the chapter I wrote there was on looking through ways that the ancient Greeks conceptualized purity, and purity of descent, and the idea of how human physical difference is impacted and cultural differences are shaped and impacted by environment and exclusive practices used to preserve that. So when I think about race, I'm not thinking about racism and proto-racism. I'm actually thinking, are there actual structural forms of oppression and exclusion that are functioning in the ancient world that we can actually use the word, that are reflective of racial practices? Race is a historically contingent concept. It's not Black people in antiquity is not race in the ancient world. Those are ethnic differences and ethnic markers. There are prejudices associated with these things, but prejudice isn't the same as a system of oppression. Right. So I make distinctions in my work between race, bio-race, sort of how we racialize people through physical difference, whether those are visible differences or the idea like anti-Semitism would fall under bio-race, anti-miscegenation practices, and ethnicity, which is more of people self-constructing or constructing externally. We would call that emic and etic constructions, from the perspective of those who form the group or from the perspective of people who perceive the group, through cultural or imaginary kinship groups or language or things like this. So I make a much broader spectrum of distinctions in my research in order to try to get at the more nuanced levels at where legal structures are functioning to create classes of people who are groups of intentional exclusion, and then the racecraft process, the sort of making of the race categories as a way to justify and naturalize exclusions. So this is what we mean by critical race theory, is the understanding the processes by which groups are racialized, and which prejudices become racism through the sort of repetitious reenactment of institutional forms of oppression. So
well, speaking of the Benjamin Isaac thing, I'm sure you did, because there was hardly any when I was trying to look him up, I couldn't hardly see any video of the guy, especially
I don't think he's particularly active. I mean, he wrote an article one time on the way that ancient science from the Hippocratic airs, waters, places, sort of started developing one of the earliest theories that we see actually get reenacted in the 19th century and 18th century as scientific racism. But he deleted that at some point.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. So I mean, I could not find a video of him except one when he was like walking behind somebody in the museum, and so that's why, hey, I couldn't believe I had him on video, and we had the exchange.
Yeah, no, it's great. I've never actually seen him talk.
The exchange that we had, and he's still alive, and he's I was surprised on his, I don't want to say boastfulness, but he was very, I don't know,
well, it's interesting because so I work a lot with I have a co-author that I'm writing a book on, understanding race in the classics with, and she's a Black woman, Jamaican Canadian Jewish woman, sort of hits all the boxes.
Nice mix.
But she actually I sent her one time Isaac promoted his book, The Origins of Racism in the West. And there's a really great chapter in there that I really like on
He's very
physiognomics.
confident in himself.
Yeah,
I
well,
love
there's
it
a
though. I
chapter in there
love
that
it.
he suggested, Goldenberg's chapter on
Yeah.
Blackness, and my colleagues of color have been very offended by that chapter.
Sounds a little archaic.
Well, it shows a well, it reflects a fact that in a lot of our historical disciplines, we don't, our colleagues are not trained in anthropological and sociological theories. They're not trained in critical race theory. They don't read people like Du Bois. They don't read, the philosophy of race. They're not reading Charles Mills. They're not reading Kwame Anthony Appiah. They're sort of they're not keeping up with the Joneses, as it were. And they think that they can just use the sort of commonplace use of the word race as if that's actually where the scholarship
that's why I like you, Rebecca.
But there's decades of scholarship on this stuff, and we should be talking to our colleagues who do this stuff professionally.
No
right?
doubt, no doubt.
So that's where we are.
Now, to the origin, that when he places it 5th century BC, kind of when racism formulated in a way. Would you say that, or earlier?
He situates it explicitly with the Hippocratic Airs, Waters, Places,
right?
Which
to
me is a later phenomenon of already racialized thinking. If you have a world that has slavery, you have racialization.
Right.
And it'll happen in different.
I figured
contexts.
you was on that track.
Yeah,
there.
It'll have different contexts. But if you have a world that's already where belonging in a city state, so in the ancient Greek world in particular, people's ethnic identities weren't Greek. They didn't call themselves Greeks. That's a Roman word, first off. So it's actually an external term put on them. But they called themselves Hellenes, but they didn't call themselves Hellenes until into the 5th century. And even then, it was still a very loose-knit identity. This is why they're constantly at war with each other, why half of them, more than half, like 2/3 of the ancient Greek city-states fought with the Persians in the Persian Wars, not against the Persians. But they used what we call an ethnica. Their ethnica was their city. Their ethnikos was their city identifier. So the Athenians, the Spartans, the Thebans, the Corinthians. And so those are the things that they would mark as their identity and what will be marked on their tombstones. And it was sort of their primary identity. Ethnicity was really complicated. They had layers of identities that they would enact in different contexts, right? So we see when you start forming those identities and you start creating exclusions in groups and out groups, right? And then of course you have a class of people who are dehumanized as the enslaved, then you're already starting the process of racecraft. And you're already working in a world that is about race making and race. Because the point of race is to create a spectrum of people who are human and people who are not human. And then you have a sort of range of people in between who are given various levels of humanity in relationship to the dominant group. So anytime you start forming citizenship constructions or in groups and out groups, exclusions and inclusions in the law and in political and social structures, then you're entering into a state of racecraft. So we see that process starting, as far back as the 7th and 8th century. Right. Yeah, and you can actually see it happening in, ancient Mesopotamia.
Right, because I read some, because I read some excerpts and things like that. That I was like, that was earlier than,
Yeah, he wants there to be, and this isn't, this isn't like a Criticize Ben Isaac show.
No, I know.
But he wants there to be, and some of my other colleagues are like this as well. They want there to be a fully developed theory of otherness.
That's
but
exactly
that
what
far precedes because they're defining race through 19th century scientific tropes.
Right.
And the environmental determinism is actually a base that was used to build those 19th century scientific tropes. What you're actually doing when you use that 19th century scientific racism framework and scientific race framework is if there are in fact actual biological physical differences that are inherent and immutable and they can't be changed. You're doing what's called racecraft, which is you're actually reproducing those racist structures in the past and using the past to reaffirm the validity of those structures in the present.
Because they had some of those where they distinguished people because of certain features or something before the so-called environmental.
Yeah, I mean the thing is that the environmental theory is not inherently in and of itself racist. Recognizing that people are different is not inherently racist. It's what you do with that, and that's why a lot of us who work with the sort of within the critical race frameworks and more anthropological and sociological frameworks,
Right.
are, basically, if there isn't actual power differentials involved, then what you're really doing is you're looking at a series of ethnic markers that can obviously be ethnocentric. This idea of center and periphery is something that inhabits all cultures that I've been able to see. Like, it's very prominent in ancient Chinese culture. It's prominent in ancient Indian cultures. It's prominent in amongst the ancient Achaemenid Persians. They actually built it into their buildings and structures. It's prominent in our Greek texts. It's prominent in our Roman texts. So you're self-centered, you're ethnocentric. Everybody else is removes away. For the Chinese, it was like, here's a concentric circle, and the further you got away from the circle, you became barbarian, more barbaric, right? But they didn't actually have any power over those people. And we can't really say that, like, the concept of so climate theory, this theory that he talks about, is actually simply a way to understand. But so, for example, think about this: when they describe the people in the far north, they describe them as they don't say they're white. Their skin is pale. They're pale, but they say they're reddened. And that's because what they're recognizing is, like, what makes the Ethiopian dark-skinned and what makes the Scythian red-skinned is pale skin with red is the climate. And so there is, in fact, an idea, and we see this in Aristotle, that the impact of the climate can happen on what they call the seed, which we would sort of like genetic matter, reproductive matter, but that if you move from one climate to another, this can in fact change you. This is why, the Mediterraneans in the middle, they mock Persians who share the same climate as them, but who cover themselves up to prevent the darkening of their skin. Whereas the Greeks embraced the term black, melakroios, for black skin, as a sign of masculinity, because it means you're outside, you're doing gymnasium. Outside, you are a warrior, you're out there doing your naked exercises, and that makes you masculine. So there's this interplay in the climate theory between how you respond to and interact with culture, with the climate, to form a culture that can then be ranked, or there's no ranking and hierarchy really, other than we're the center and everybody else is not us.
Right. No, because I read some excerpts about about vegetation, wherever there was also a quote talking about what wherever there's more vegetation or whatever, or marvelous fruit,
marvelous plants, marvelous animals,
or something,
there's going to be marvelous people,
right. But at the same time, like, wherever there's marvelous plants or fruit or food or whatever, they can't be a courageous man.
So that's not in fact true.
The
sources aren't
one with
consistent.
right? That's what I'm saying. It's not consistent, like the Europeans.
Because the Scythians are barbarian, the Germans are barbarians, the Gauls are barbarians, but they're all considered really courageous because they have an excess of blood and an excess of phlegm, and so they're too dim-witted to recognize.
But not intelligent, correct? That's what I was getting to.
But we see that flipped and reversed in many contexts. But if you look at something like India, they have fantastic, marvelous peoples, like people with dog heads, people with eyeballs in the head in the middle of their chest, like.
But cowardice.
But they don't have cowardice. They're marked by bravery.
Wow.
Because you have this problem where just because a theory develops, it's not going to be a consistent theory, because you then have experience that then intersects. Because the Persians are represented in earlier Athenian texts predominantly as effeminate. But Alexander goes over there and he actually starts adopting Persian practices. And he embraces them and turns them into, he starts training Persian boys in Greek warfare style. And this, of course, bothers his Macedonians, but he's like, I'm doing this. He starts wearing Persian clothing and, all these sorts of things. The Athenians themselves, when they pushed back the Persians out of the islands, they adopted Persian practices. They were obsessed with Persian fashion and, all this sorts of stuff. So we can't, this is the problem. Like, when you have these sort of unnuanced idea at the level of a theory, that isn't actually not putting it into the context in where it's enacted. This is why you can't say in the ancient Greek and Roman world that this is a theory that everybody followed, because they didn't follow it the same way. The center is constantly shifting, depending on who's the source. And for Vitruvius, who's the architect, who wrote an architectural manual for the Romans, Rome, of course, is the center, but he's not interested. He's actually, the body for him is the model for architectural form. But the Romans were convinced that they could, in fact, engineer their environments to improve the people who lived there. You improve the climate, you improve the people, because everybody had recognized since the 5th century medical texts that if you lived in a swamp, people were going to have, jaundice and get malaria. They didn't understand the mechanisms for transmission, but they understood that swampy climates cause yellowed skin, can cause illness, can cause effeminacy and weakness, as they saw it, bloating in the skin.
And I remember
the Romans were like, yeah, but we can just freaking drain that swamp and we've improved everybody.
Right.
And you see this too with Alexander. He founds all these cities all over the Eurasian continent, and they build temples and theaters and marketplaces because they are manufacturing identities. Anybody could become Greek by the 3rd century by simply enacting Greek culture. And we see this in texts across the board. So I'm hesitant. I'm always hesitant to say that the environmental theory that Hippocrates put in place, we don't see those same markers when you get to Vitruvius and to Vegetius writing in the 4th century CE. He's writing a military manual about how to recruit soldiers, right? He's got a very different vested interest, and it's 900 years later. The theory is not consistent, right, across time. So I'm always hesitant to say that the theory is this. This is why when we edited this volume on identity in the environment, we tracked this theory from the 6th century all the way up through the 15th century, right? Because it changes and shifts over time, and different groups. When Christians emerge as an ethnic group along the lines of Jews in the ancient world. When we get to the 12th century CE, Jews, Christians, and Muslims are all considered ethnic groups in some ways, right? So I mean, and they're racialized differently.
So are you saying that we can't really pinpoint? Nobody has done any true definitive work, as you know, that can really pinpoint when it, because it's like you said, it's no thing where it just kind of starts.
I actually think the search for origins and to the invention moment at the beginning is actually a
damn near impossible.
It's not even impossible. It's actually a fool's journey. It is. There's no. Why do we need to know? We need to know how it's acting in the context.
Yeah. No, I get it. I was just, the question's out there though, and
the question is out there because we're obsessed with the idea of firsts, right?
Right.
Like who was the first to do this? And that's actually a product, the concept of progress, right? Evolutionary thinking. If you can find the moment and then move beyond it, like who did it first? But who did it first is often the person who did it first.
That intrigued me when it said the invention and origin.
But he didn't look at what the Chinese were doing in the same period. And if you look at what the Chinese are doing in the same period, you see very similar discourses. You see, they're talking about qi instead of about phlegm, but they have words for barbarians. They're doing this ethnocentric modeling. They're doing environmental theory. They're doing all this stuff over in China at the same exact time. So invention, whose invention? It's a Eurocentric perspective to say that the Greeks and Romans, and it's also a Eurocentric perspective to say that the Greeks and Romans are Europeans. They lived on 3 continents. They were born up. People who are Greek and Roman lived their entire lives, never going to Rome or going to mainland Greece at all. So we have to think about what's happening down in Alexandria is going to be different than what's happening in Athens, from what's going to be happening in Ephesus on what's now Turkey. Is going to be different from what's happening, all the way over in Antioch, which is in Syria, right? And what's happening over in the border regions of Afghanistan, which had Greek settlements and interactive, right? All these things are going to be different because the contexts are different and the climates are different. I mean, if you live on the Nile, your life is very different.
Absolutely.
Your understanding of how environment impacts culture and people is very different than if you're living up on the Black Sea.
Right. Now, the study, I forgot to get into that. The study of, and I've heard you speak on it, the study of classical studies, whether it's anthropology, history, when you get into racism and in those departments and things like that. What is your take on that? I've heard you mention some things.
Yeah. So the when I use the word classics, I always put it in air scare quotes or whatever, but it's actually the institutionalized study at the academic level. Like if we're talking about sort of the ancient Greek and Roman culture and pop culture and stuff in the wilds, that's not classics. Classics is an academic discipline.
Right.
And as an academic discipline, it has a long history of exclusionary practices along the lines of race. I mean, we have direct quotations from the early sort of creators of this discipline about how they did not think in the United States, right, that African Americans had the so street cleaner is going by right now.
No problem. Let's keep it going.
They did not have the intellectual capacity to understand Greek, right? Or so they were excluded. So when people like Du Bois, went to Harvard, he actually talks about in The Dawn of Dusk is one of his autobiographical books where he's trying to get at what he calls the race concept. So this is sort of like 1950 or something. And he's sort of looking back over his education. When he got into Harvard, he had to sort of deal with the fact that he was being taken around to museums and being taken to, classes where his very ability to be there was being taught is impossible because he had black skin.
Right.
And we have, there's a whole school of literature. So one of the things that I'm working on for a future publication, and I know some colleagues on the archaeology side who are working on this, is when did the Greeks and Romans become white? And so this is a process that takes place over the course of the 19th century, where they are intentionally crafting this alternative in the context of anti-blackness, of like actually trying to exclude Black people, whether it was in Europe or whether it was in the United States, from the study of this world. And so they were actually erasing them from the world and then creating gatekeeping barriers to keep them out of the educational system to study. And then they use that. They're like, well, there are no Black classicists. It's because they're not capable. No, it's because you have a requirement that they have to do X, and you don't actually allow them into the spaces to learn X.
Like I said, you were the second person that I've spoken to. Dr. Carconi had mentioned that too, and definitely you went in it and was more thorough about it. And you're talking about how languages
they were used as a gatekeeper.
As a gatekeeper, correct. And you were given examples of how, in certain schools they don't have Latin or certain classical languages to get in these certain programs.
And it used to be that up until over the course between 1890 and up until 1954, you had to pass either a Greek and Latin or just a Latin exam just to get into college. Right. And so over the course of those years, Columbia, I think, got rid of its Greek requirement in the 1890s, but you had to still pass a Latin exam, right? Just to start a degree. Right. And it really wasn't until we get to the GI Bill that things start to change. But then, of course, we have the problem: who wasn't covered by the GI Bill in the United States?
That's a whole nother
Black veterans,
right? For sure.
right.
I'm one of them. I was in the Air Force myself for about 6.5 years. Yeah.
So the institution. This is what we talk about when we talk about race, right? These are institutional processes that can operate even after you say that you have law. You might say, oh, everyone is equal in the law, but you have all these institutional processes that prevent and exclude. And so academic institutions are no different than government institutions in this regard, or banks, or sort of other places where we see these types of intentionally exclusionary, but pretend they're not. We call it colorblindness, right? Processes. And so, so classics was often used. And this is why you see, for your viewers who are wondering what the hell is going on in the United States right now.
Banning of books.
Well, but one of the things that we saw last summer is this sort of Princeton announced that it was going to make the language requirements for its undergraduate major optional. So if students were more interested in the archaeology, or they were more interested in the art history stuff, they didn't have to do both languages. Like when I went to school, I was a first generation college student, and I didn't know what Greek and Latin were, but I wanted to study the development of Christianity. And so I learned that I had to learn Greek if I wanted to read it, read the New Testament in its original. I was going to learn Hebrew to, read the Hebrew Bible. And then you had to sort of learn Latin in order to do ecclesiastical history. But so I didn't start my languages until I got to college.
And you had an interesting background, as I might add, because I've heard some other thing about your kind of
Yeah, like half my
multinational.
family's Japanese and Pacific Islander,
Right,
and then like my other half family is like all like they're like immigrants from Eastern
right,
Europe.
right,
So
right,
sort of
right.
this sort of hodgepodge family.
Which
In
got
the
you
world.
into looking towards identity and race
Yeah,
and certain things.
yeah.
And yeah, yeah. I'm
So,
trying to
but
just
you
kind of
have this
shoot it in there.
problem,
Yeah.
right? Where like I didn't start the languages until I got into college, and to get into graduate schools, people like me are often excluded because we don't have enough of the language,
Hmm.
right? Because
Hmm.
our high
Hmm.
schools don't, my high school offered Japanese, but
Right. Yeah, and that's hey, yeah,
because I went to a minority white high school that was predominantly Filipino and Vietnamese, and
right,
Chinese and Laotian immigrants.
right, right.
Um,
Mm,
this is what happens when you live in a Navy town
right, for
on the West
sure,
Coast.
for sure. Um, Another subject, Eurocentrism and Afrocentrism. To you, your understanding of that. I've the last interview I did, I don't know if you caught that. It was with an author, lecturer, Na Dove, who talks about.
I didn't catch that
Uh,
one.
yeah, well, in that interview, it was yesterday actually. In that
Yeah, I
interview,
was like that.
yeah, in that interview, yes, I had a special guest in there who joined. In there was Mo Lefi Asante, yeah,
I've
who's
read I've read his
right.
I've used some of his stuff in one of my classes. So
Basically the godfather of Afrocentricity,
yeah,
and that was
I think he's at Temple, right? Temple University.
yeah, yeah, and both of them are at Temple.
Yeah, I used his
And
history of Africa in my.
right, right. He was in the discussion yesterday that I had. That was surprising. I
That's
had no
cool.
clue.
That's like
Yeah, yeah, I had no clue he was gonna be in there. I was gonna talk to Nod Duff because she's written a blueprint handbook about Afrocentric schooling and stuff like that. And so he came in there. But my point was your view of Eurocentrism versus Afrocentrism and your understanding or whatnot and how it plays a role in
yeah. So
scholarship.
one of the problems that happens is that people don't understand the context for the emergence of the Afrocentric movements, which is in direct response to Eurocentric and
Right,
to Jim Crow segregation in the United States and
right,
to sort of all these things.
right,
And so in some ways, oftentimes it simply posits an alternate narrative that is still it's still fixated on the same point in time. Like, are Egyptians black? Well, that question only is valid if you are wondering what if the other side is saying that they're white,
mm,
right? The, our texts use the word black to refer to Egyptians, but the problem is that neither of these categories, white or black, actually were used in antiquity to apply to themselves. Capital B black and capital W white, as opposed to little b black and little w white, right? They have different parameters. And so if you're asking the question, I always say because every conversation about antiquity on the
mm,
internet devolves into, well, are Egyptians black?
mhm.
Like all the white supremacist groups, like they're all obsessed with this, and they're obsessed
They
with it
are,
because of
and they act like
Afrocentric positions.
we
People
are
are
all the
obsessed with it
time.
because of
Yeah, yeah,
Eurocentric
right,
19th century positions. And my view on it is that it's the wrong question.
right, right.
Of
Because
course,
I'm going to get into, because I'm going to
there
get
are
in.
people from
Right,
ancient Egypt who, in
right,
our categorization of people as black, we would categorize them as black today,
right,
but they would never have called themselves that.
right, right,
So
right.
my interest is actually in trying to reconstruct how the ancients talked about themselves
How they see
and
themselves.
represented themselves,
Absolutely.
and then understanding how that can help us get out of what we're still stuck in these 19th century racist narratives.
Right,
And Afrocentrism and Eurocentrism are both two sides of that same racist narrative.
right,
And
right.
we can't break it until we actually go back to the ancient sources and stop saying,
Mm,
here's how we racialize people. Let's look how, if they did the same, let's see who is racialized like that in the ancient world.
mm.
And instead of asking a different set of questions,
I mean,
which
it's
is,
still, I
how did
mean,
Egyptians talk about themselves?
right. I mean, in the political climate with the banning of books, CRT and all these, I mean, obviously the conversation is still going on and on.
Yeah,
And it's
yeah.
uh,
Because right now, with what they call CRT is just U.S. history,
right, right,
right? And
right.
it's they just don't want to talk about they want to pretend. And this is where I don't know if you've ever seen this book. Bonilla Silva wrote a book called Racism Without Racists.
I've heard of it.
Right. It's
I've
colorblind
heard.
policy, right? This is the sort
Right.
of policies that started getting enacted in the 80s and 90s where we passed civil rights legislation, and so we'll just pretend that racism never happened, and that we treat everyone the same regardless of their skin color. But they didn't actually change the mechanisms of how they did things. So you have, Black communities being decimated by the building of freeways. We know that bank loans go disproportionately to white people in different neighborhoods. That the valuation of your house will be different if the owner
no
is Black
doubt.
versus if the owner is white.
No doubt.
So what's happening over the last, since 2016.
Even the areas they introduced you to.
Yeah. But
yeah, I was a product of that.
Since 2015, 2016, the actual realities, these fissures, this sort of like the tension between the image of colorblindness and the image, the reality of the fact that racism permeates our society, have came out in the open. And so we're in this period of what people refer to as white backlash, where it's like they want to go back to that place where we don't talk about race. And so and this is why I say it's so important for us to understand that race isn't just prejudice, and that people aren't races based on our like modern scientific categories.
Tell me about it.
If you don't recognize that racism is about power and that race is about the enactment of oppression, then you can postulate that white people can have racism against them by just talking about the fact that white people.
I've been saying that, folks.
Right.
And she's saying it. She white. I didn't expect her to get in deep like that. He's gonna get into some history and some racism and ancient texts, but break it down. That's why I like you. You're a rapid fire. Actually, you're. I realize you're out of all my guests so far. You're good. I like you. You're a good talker and you're rapid fire. You're like, and you do not allow me to interrupt you like my. And you already you've seen some of, I guess, some video, whatever. You will keep it moving. I like you, man.
Yeah. But I think that you need to think about though is that one of the reasons why I approach the ancient world as I do, go into the ancient world as I do, is because there have to be other ways.
You're thorough. I like it.
Deal with this stuff. And we can't pretend that race doesn't exist. Like this is one of the positions. If you tie race explicitly to the transatlantic slave trade and to the emergence of Blackness in the modern world, then you ignore the fact that we are just continually reproducing forms of oppression and making excuses for them. So like I'm trying to sort of dismantle that narrative.
Right.
And that's why I sort of position Afrocentrism as I think it's important to understand, to study it, to understand it, and to actually put it in its context and understand why Afrocentrism has emerged, why it continues to have influence, but also recognizing that it's a flip side to Eurocentrism.
Right.
And not an answer to it. Because, as much as I love Asante's book, I use it for my students because I want them to recognize that what we're getting is an alternate, we did it first narrative. I mean, I've gotten emails before. I did when I did one of those videos on the Dorian, quote unquote, Dorian invasion, right? The Nordic invasion of Greece. I got an email from some guy who said, "You're exactly right. The Germans did not, they're not, Germans are not, the original Greeks. There was no invasion, blah, blah," because it was actually the Poles. Right. It's just like replacing one race.
Replacement there, right?
And just recently there was a controversy here in Greece. The former president of the Academy of Athens, which is sort of like, the British Royal Society, something like this. He was an engineer, and he gave a speech as he was going out where he basically said the Greeks invented the alphabet. They had the first alphabet ever, and they're the original everything. And so one of the members of this recently got published in the minutes of the Academy without any sort of comment from the actual archaeologists and historians and everybody who are also members of the Academy. And so a Greek ancient historian and archaeologist who's a fellow at Princeton, he wrote an op-ed letter in one of the Greek newspapers saying that that Greek nationalism of this type is just it's just replacing one form of racism with another.
Just like over here in Norway, when I first get here, we discovered weed wasn't Columbus, it was Leif Erikson. I mean, so everybody has their
because there were no indigenous people.
Right. Yep. No, okay, so we have 15 minutes or less. So let's try to kind of quickly go through some things. I want to try to shoot them. And you have the cognitive ability to do that because you are that great. Um,
rapid fire. Yeah.
and okay, so I didn't realize. Well, you talking about didn't realize your. Dang, there was something else I was going to ask, but we'll go to. Well, I didn't realize your age, but when you start to talk about the Black Athena, which I heard, before, it showed your age because the debate was kind of back then.
It was
The
happening when I was a student, right? It was like
Right, right. Oh, now I remember.
college. Yeah.
Yeah, because during that time at college or whatever, I had heard you mention the sit-in with the Black Panthers. I'm
Yeah,
wearing
yeah,
a
yeah.
Black
So
Panther
the
t-shirt.
college I attended, so I told you that earlier, this college that I attended, that
Right,
we, it was
right,
like core requirement. We were all reading
right,
landmark civil rights cases, and we're
right.
reading, sort of CRT and sort of lots of Black authors and stuff, is because my college was founded in the it was in 66 or 67, but it was
Right,
actually founded as a response to the assassination of Martin Luther King.
right,
So UCSD was premised on the idea that they would have a sort of different college system where each college, like the Oxford Cambridge model, you had different requirements and
right,
sort of different ethos to the college. And so originally this college was supposed to be founded as a history where we would study history, so we won't be doomed to repeat it.
right.
And then Martin Luther King was assassinated, and then a bunch of the students on campus started saying, no, we want actually a social justice, a social activism,
Right,
political activism college.
right, right,
And so then what happened is that they started pushing it back. They created their own package of what they wanted the college to look like. And they started pushing back on it. And they got some faculty were very receptive and yeah, let's do this, right? And some administrators were a little apprehensive about the whole thing. And then so they occupied with the help of the Black Panthers, they occupied the registrar's office at the college.
Hey.
And
Well,
after 3 years of sort of pushing on this, they finally got this college
mm,
that would center social justice and the history of race and the history of social justice movements and society, and that would actually dedicate. So at a lot of universities in the UC system, you can accept students who come from non-traditional backgrounds or who maybe don't have the 4.0 GPA and the 1600 SAT scores that you often need to get into a University of California school. They often give those exception spots to athletes. And our college actually gives them, or gave them when I was there, to students who came from non-traditional backgrounds who wouldn't have had access.
right.
So I was a first generation college student. That's actually how I ended up at that college. But we had one of the most diverse student bodies, and sort of they tried to live the ethos of social activism as part of the college mission. So that's actually the
Right.
sort of, that's how I
Cool.
started college, and this was all happening when I started college. We were at the tail end of the publication, the sort of Bernal's publication of Black Athena,
Right,
the first volume.
right.
And so we were sort of because that came out in 89, I think, and I started college in 93.
Okay,
So
okay.
yeah.
So we have less than 10 minutes. So we're gonna try to we're gonna try to go through 10 or 12 questions, very concise as you can.
All right.
Okay. And these are common questions amongst people. What are about the ancient Egyptians, what they think of themselves? Was ancient Egypt African culture?
Absolutely. Their view was south. It was up the Nile. It wasn't anywhere else. It was, people have tried to say that Egypt is separate from the rest of Africa and they look to Asia, but the Nile was their path.
So as far as DNA tests, Egypt, modern day Egyptians now, I don't, that's kind of a
we have millennia, because we have the Arab invasion
right.
or reset and settlement. We have mass migrations of people over time. You cannot compare modern populations to ancient populations. You either need to do a DNA study that is like a trans
because
ancient.
didn't they have because you'll have some like you pointed out in one of your other videos, there's one of a staunch racist his historians that
He's not a
wrote.
historian. He's a statistician.
There you go. And you said he hasn't published work since the 80s.
He hasn't published anything on this.
Right.
He focuses on statistics, but he
Okay.
puts a lot of data up on the internet,
Right.
attempting to. It's basically Arab anti-blackness. He in fact doesn't even want to be considered Arab. He wants to be considered Greek.
But didn't they have a recent study? Well, they did some sort of DNA test of modern day Egyptians, and it kind of went in their mind towards their favor. They were linked towards Egyptians, but then I heard the study was kind of not.
All these studies are janky.
Right.
So I'll give you.
In the words of Tariq Nasheed, janky. Yeah, I got you.
I'll give you an example. The only thing we can actually tell from first, you can't compare to modern populations. The millions of people who have mass migrations that have occurred over the last 1,500 years have completely altered the landscape.
Absolutely.
What you have to do is you have to study ancient DNA, but ancient DNA is problematic because it's hard to extract. And because of the categories that we use for how we decide who goes onto what continent are racist categories that are rooted in 19th century decision making. So the best things to do are to actually track strontium and oxygen isotopes in the teeth to see if there are people who have diets that can reflect the different landscapes that might have existed in other places. And then you cross-reference that with these sort of genetic markers. But you have to, so there's a recent study about the ancient Etruscans who were in Italy, and everybody always thought they were an immigrant population from what is modern day Turkey, because they had a non-Indo-European language and because they had a lot of cultural practices that were more like what was happening over in Persia and in with the Eastern Greeks. And so a group of people got together and they took as much ancient DNA as possible across all these. They took all these other studies that people were doing, and then they put them all together. So they had a much larger body, and they realized that no, the population of Italy was almost homogenous, and it had, and the only evidence of incursions from other places was back in like the 15th century BCE. And so over this 800-year period, you had a pretty homogenous population. They just chose to speak this other language and to cultivate it. So you can't use those things as like markers, but you have to put all these things in play. And what often happens in these ancient DNA studies, if you got a bunch of geneticists out here who are not talking to the archaeologists or the historians, they're not actually caring about the find spots. They think you can take 7 bodies and take their find spot and use that as an indicator of them being indigenous to that location. And that simply doesn't work.
So your definitive answer, short answer, would be you don't believe that the modern day Arabs that live in that live in Egypt are linked to ancient Egypt necessarily.
They are, I'm sure, because we know that the Arab Peninsula, there was migration back and forth.
Okay.
But the majority population is going to be, from that. There's so much migration. But for example, that ancient, what is now Eritrea and Ethiopia, in that area, we have a lot of interaction between the Arabian Peninsula and there, right? And so obviously there's intermixture. It's all intermixture. That's the point.
Okay. From Cleopatra being black, Hannibal Barca being black, definitive, quick, short on that. I got.
If we remove the capital B, no, they're not going to be capital B black.
Right.
But Cleopatra considered herself an Egyptian.
Right.
And she had multiple identities. In some contexts,
she's part of Ptolemy.
In some contexts, she was Greek. In some contexts, she actually wanted to be, something else. But it's
not what she wanted to be. What
Well, no one in the ancient, she would never have been mistaken for a Roman, but she was certainly interested in having her son be recognized as a Roman. Right. So what does that mean for her own identity? So we just have to, again, the terms of the conversation are the wrong terms.
True that.
And then in terms of
because there's so many other characters, Saint Augustine's,
all these people
Septimus Severus,
all these people are African.
Right.
Because they are born and raised in Africa. All of these people also have other descent markers within them.
Absolutely. You on that channel there, Study Antiquity, hit on a lot of questions already. Ancient Egypt, African culture, we already asked that. Let me see, because we only got like 5 more minutes, so we can let you go to your museum with your students. The broken noses. Why do so many have them? And that was one
because they stick out.
Right. It wasn't because of Napoleon.
I mean, maybe Napoleon was chiseling stuff off, but more like things are broken off because they're sticking out. The way that that ancient sculpture works is if some like arms are often gone, legs are often gone, anything that sticks
The
out.
natural wear and tear. Yeah.
Well, just to give you a story from ancient Athens in the 5th century, the Athenians used to have these things called herms that were attached to their doors to ward off evil. And it was basically the god Dionysus's head with then on a stone slab with a erect penis sticking out. And one night, a bunch of drunk guys went out, a guy named Alcibiades and his friends went out and got drunk, and they knocked off all the penises, right? Because it was sticking out.
Okay.
It's not they're trying to hide that these noses are larger shaped.
Right.
They didn't want people to know they're African. It's prominent piece of a piece of stone that is going to get wear and tear and accidental damage over time.
Okay. And then the last part, you can. It was so many other questions, but it doesn't matter. The last.
I'm happy to come back on into later.
Yeah. I'm trying to just. The last thing you could talk about is what I love when you got into about the charismatic, as you put it, a charismatic authority of the field. Another part of a structural element of racism. When you gave examples of Achilles, 300 Scotsmen playing Greeks and Spartans, and Achilles being looked at as blonde and stuff like that. Could you get just the last part of this?
And maybe I'll actually take this from the position I just finished writing. I just published an article on the racist backlash to the casting of David Ghazi as Achilles in the BBC series Troy Fall of the City, and the backlash was really vitriolic. In no small part because people were like, Achilles.
Well, in that Netflix series, is it like a black guy playing?
Yeah, it's because he's black. He's I think he's like British Guyanan or
okay. So it created a controversy amongst obviously.
Yeah.
Oh,
so they also cast Zeus with a black actor, and then some of the god Athena. But it's interesting to me, of course, the women were cast with light-skinned black actresses, and both Achilles and Zeus were cast with dark-skinned black actors. So there's a colorism dynamic going on already. But people were angry, and they kept trying to say, but Achilles is blonde. And because this word xanthus that occurs in the Greek, which could also just mean shiny. And in fact, it also could mean a range of colors all the way down to like almost my color of hair. But more importantly, you see a lot of the Balkan nationalist groups and Greek nationalist groups emerge because Achilles is a mythical figure that they actually claim as a historical ancestor. And as the claim of parts of northern Greece, which in the modern world have been included or excluded from being part of the Greek nation state based on the geopolitical dynamics of what's happening in the Balkans and in Europe. And so this fits into this problem of whether Macedonian Greeks in the modern space are Greek or not. And it's a huge controversy. And so death threats are flying because they want to claim Achilles as an actual ancestor based on a couple lines of description without thinking about the fact that these are living documents that have a life outside of that history. And every culture is going to adopt them to their own. I can see how the Greeks are mad that there has actually never been an English language movie or actual TV show or anything that has actually cast Greeks in Greek characters.
Right.
So I get that that's that might irritate you after. I think the closest is they cast Armand Assante, who's Italian, like American, as as Odysseus. And Maria Callas was Medea. Again, they're not Greeks. She's like the one time they had a Greek. But it was in an Italian film. And so, yes, there's a lot of laying claim to the past through figures like Achilles. And then when people break, they sort of recognize that this is a mythical figure who can actually transport time and space and be adopted by other communities because of the power of these stories over time.
And that shapes public people's opinions and things.
Backlashes because Achilles has always been white in the casting and always been American, or British. He's Brad Pitt, right? Then
Troy.
Then the casting of him as a black man becomes a political. If you cast someone who's not white, it's political. If you cast someone who's white, it's neutral. And that's their positionality, that's their mental landscape, and that's what we mean by colorblindness, right? White is the default neutral, so this is the sort of white supremacist premise is that white is neutral and everything else is a deviation from that. And so, and if you lay claim to Achilles, if you cast a black man as Achilles, then what you've done is you've somehow being imagined to lay claim to that Greek past and erase the heritage of these others. And so they make it into this genetic heritage battle, when in fact it's simply the life of a piece of literature over thousands of years in time, and the human imagination's ability to adapt it and enjoy it.
Well, it's 12 o'clock, so that's time for you to go now. 12:01.
Thanks for having me on. And like I said, I'm happy to come back if you want to like roll through some more stuff.
Right. You know, if I do be about a month from now or so, something like that, I'll hit you up to email or whatnot whenever you're available.
Let me know.
Yeah. But thanks for the rapid fire session there, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your time in Greece.
Yes, thanks so much.
Thank
Time
you.
to hit some museums.